Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Good to have you join with us. As you know, I do pastor a church, and in the course of preaching, we come up with communion once in a while. And so we just take a break, and I give a communion message. I have 28 messages on communion, and I rotate them in, and it takes anywhere from 7 to 10 years to get through all of them. But nevertheless, I look at communion in several different angles. And so it's my custom to preach a communion message. And as I do that, um, this is called Walking Our Feet Down Memory Lane. And we have the message on Sunday morning, but oftentimes we have our communion Sunday evening because it takes the whole evening. Our communions are a little bit different than some churches. Some churches uh, even if they have it every Sunday, they just incorporate it right into their service. It takes about 5 minutes and it's over. But ours has an agape or communion meal. It's a sit down meal, not necessarily uh, feast proportions, but we have a sit down meal, and the bread and the cup are taken from that, and we also have the foot washing service. And most people that's not something they have done before as a foot washing service. And I was raised in the Methodist tradition before I became Brethren, and this was a new thing for me. And I read the passage in John 13, and I just had never really seen that before. The Lord washed the disciples' feet and told us that we should do it too. And it was done the same night that he did the bread and the cup. And the agape, or the Lord's Supper, which then oftentimes is called the agape or love feast. And so most people don't kick about, oh, you have a love feast too. Well, I'm all right with that. But then when you say foot washing, you say, ooh, they have some type of reaction. Hey, let's be careful about that. Our Lord washed other people's feet and said we should do it. He wanted us to have whatever it was, that it was his attitude in doing that. And he did it that night in relationship to two other things that have symbolism, and the foot washing has symbolism. So let's be careful about how quickly we reject things. And once you see it in that passage, you can't unsee it. And so when I look at John 13 and I read about it and I see that it's part of communion, I say, of course, it seems so logical. Well, the Brethren movement hadn't been in existence forever. It started in 1708. It was the same year that the Methodist Church started over there in England, 1708. We were primarily Germanic. Um, and we'd been doing the threefold communion ever since 1708, so it's been over 300 years. But as we will see, the threefold communion actually goes back to the Last Supper. Threefold communion is a treasure given to us by the Lord. Now we better pay attention to that. Don't easily just flick it off with the wave of a hand. All three parts given that night. All three parts have great symbolic meaning that you would expect in an ordinance. You look at the ordinance, it's something that you do, but it has symbolism beyond that. And then all three complete a beautiful picture. The bread and the cup is justification of the church. The foot washing is sanctification of the church. And the marriage feast of the Lamb, the agape, symbolizing that, is glorification of the church. It's the past work of Christ, the present work of Christ, and the future work of Christ. And so that has a full picture. You wouldn't say, this is my family, and then crop off two people. It's a full picture. And so you want to have the whole picture that the Lord intended for them to see. Now, if we turn in our Bibles to Ephesians chapter 5, it's very curious that Paul is saying these words. He says, husbands, verse 25, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her. Oh, isn't that interesting? That would be symbolized by the bread and the cup. So that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of the water with the word. So you get saved. That's the work at the cross. And then after you're saved, there's a work that goes on in the bride's life to sanctify her. That's symbolized in the bread, in the foot washing. And then says that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. And there's the marriage feast of the Lamb, the bride in her white dress being presented there. And so that's the picture that we're seeing in that. Now, Paul didn't say, hey, by the way, I'm talking about the communion service, but it is illustrative of what the communion service means and could be easily laid down beside the communion service, a full picture. Now, this threefold picture has been understood as such from the beginning, and this is news to many Christians. Seldom from disagreeing pulpits do you hear people say, now the brethren and many others have a threefold communion. We just do the bread and the cup. They don't even give time from the pulpit about that. But we want to tell you that we have a full threefold communion. And they may claim that there is no value in John 13 as far as it being an ordinance, and we say that it is. We see the ordinance, part of the ordinance of communion. They say they do not see it. It's just something the Lord did that night to teach humility. Well, certainly there's humility involved, but there's a lot more that it symbolizes than that. And so he said in John 13 some interesting things. He said, verse 12, so when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, do you know what I have done to you? Now it was sufficiently different than what they had ever experienced before. They've washed their feet. But usually people would wash the feet of themselves and not wash each other's feet. And so they were kind of wondering what in the world was going on here. And he said, you call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. I just never could escape, if the Lord physically washed the disciples' feet. And he said we should do it because he's the Lord and teacher and Lord, and he did it. We should do it too. There's a one-to-one correspondence there. I don't know how you can slip that, but people manage. It says, for I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you. Well, now, somebody say, I'll polish your shoes instead, or I'll rake your leaves, or I'll be your servant some other way. Well, that's nice, and certainly that servanthood is a very wonderful thing, and your humility and your humbleness is wonderful, but the Lord washed their feet, and you're supposed to do that too, and it's part of the symbol that night that he did. And that's how the early church understood it. It says, truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is the one who was sent greater than one who sent him. So, therefore, if we are servants of the Lord, we should do it. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them. And my friends, you do get a blessing. It is something that teaches you, it's something that reminds you, it's something that shows you what the Lord is doing. And so here the church is reminding themselves of the cleansing and the washing of the water of the Word, and iron sharpening iron, and the church coming together and helping each other in the sanctifying process of rubbing shoulders with one another and encouraging each other. Let us consider how to uh, uh, not neglect the assembling together, as is the habit of some, but all the more meeting that we might stimulate one another to love and good works. There's a sense in which that process is involved here. And so, my friends, some say that's just humility. There is humility, but there's much more. And therefore, who can say that it should be understood as part of the ordinance? And I'd say, well, the early church, under the watchful eye of the apostles, was doing this everywhere. And so you have it in 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 10. Some people think that this is the only passage, but it isn't. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 10. And some spin it a different way and they see it a different way, but this is the order of a widow. A widow was a widow indeed. It didn't have really a way to make ends meet, and the church, if she was a godly person, stepped in and helped her. Verse 9, a widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, interesting, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. Well, people generally, if they don't want to see the foot washing as communion, they say, well, she was just a real servant to everybody. And you can say that partly, but knowing John 13, this was also saying that she was deeply connected in with the church, and she was a participant in the deep things of the church. She wasn't somebody who absented herself from that. And he used one part of it, perhaps to show that she was a servant attitude, but also that she participated in the rest of it too. And you wouldn't want to put a widow on the list if she never came to communion, so there you have it. And then John 13, that Paul wrote this Timothy passage in 63 to 66 AD in there. That's about 30 years after the church began. And then John 13, 1 through 20, which is the passage we're referring to here. This passage was written by the Apostle Paul and anywhere from 85 to 90 AD, 60 years after the church started. And he is referring to our Lord's words, and he said this in 30 to 33 AD. So this goes all the way back to the beginning. And some people say, well, John 13, that's just one passage. Well, tut. Wait a second. That's not one passage, like one verse. This is 17 verses. This is a treatise. And these are the Lord's words. And nobody said, oh, Jesus didn't say that. And for reasons that are known only to God, The Apostle John was the cleanup header. He wrote 90% new material in his gospel. And this is what he put in there that the others did not have. And if you say, oh, the bread and the cup and the other three, the synoptic gospels, just have the bread and the cup that they talk about, and then John mentions this, are you saying, oh, this wasn't part of communion? It was the same night. And the early church also understood it that way. So we go all the way back to 33 AD with the Lord's words. There was a comment made in 63 to 66 AD with the apostles' words, and then John said it in 90 AD, quoting the Lord's words that were stated 60 years earlier. And Paul's comments in Ephesians 5:25 through 27, mirroring the three parts of communion, the bread and the cup, the foot washing, and the love feast, or the marriage feast of the Lamb, as we like to call it. Now, history of the practice of foot washing as an ordinance. I pick foot washing because most people don't struggle with having the bread and the cup. And, oh, a meal, sure, let's add that in. That's a great idea. And then, oh, we do the foot washing. He rose from supper and he washed the disciples' feet. Now they struggle with that. Well, when I was a young man and I was coming from the Methodist tradition, I got saved, and there was a Bible preaching church in town that had a pretty good preacher, and it was a Brethren church, and I went there, and they were having communion, and they explained to me this passage. I read it, and I said, oh, I just had never really noticed it that way before. And there was a paradigm shift in my mind, and it says, the Lord said, I'm your master and teacher. I did this. You should do it. Okay, no problem with that. Now, I wish more people just were like that. And for me, it was just very simple. And I wasn't thinking, oh, wash somebody's feet. I don't want to touch somebody's feet. I don't want to have somebody wash my feet. No, what I was thinking about is the Lord did this, and He asked me to do it, so I'm not going to have a problem with it. Now, did the early church understand this as part of an ordinance? The answer is yes. These names probably won't mean much to you because they've been dead for nearly 2,000 years, but they were in the first century. You know, the Apostle John, he lived till almost the close of the first century, and then you start into the 100s. And Irenaeus, a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. See, you know, John died in about somewhere between 95 and 100 AD, and Polycarp was a disciple of his, and then he had Irenaeus, who was a disciple of his, Polycarp. And he was quite the writer, and when he was writing, he wrote about things, and one of the things he wrote about was the ordinance of the foot washing. Tertullian speaks of the ordinance. He was around 160 to 190 AD in his writing, and he spoke about the love feast and the foot washing, and of course the bread and the cup. Augustine, 350 AD, very clear, the Lord instituted a sign. The Synod of Toledo, 694 AD, made mention of it. Even expelled from the communion those who refused to participate in the ordinance, foot washing. Council of Elvira first noted opposition to the foot washing was in 307 AD, and the reason why there was an opposition was it was widely practiced, and there was some people who were abusing it and not doing it right. So there was some statement about that. But there you have, from from the time of Christ all the way up to 694 AD, there was continuous practice of the threefold communion with the foot washing involved. Church historians agree that the early church did practice such an ordinance. Now, I mentioned the heavy hitters that were the church historians, Caito, which was biblical encyclopedia. He says, became foot washing became, as might be expected, part of the observances practiced by the early church. McClintock and Strong said there was also a general celebration of the Lord's Supper at which the ceremony of washing of feet was connected. Schaff, I have Schaff's history. I have in 3 volumes, but it's written in 7. I have mine condensed. But Schaff has a 7-volume history of the church, and he wrote the washing of feet as described in John 13:4 through 16 seems to answer fully to the conception of a sacrament combining all 3 elements, an outward sign, the visible act, and the express command. And then Yoder, God's Means of Grace, pages 338 through 348, contains all of these quotes above, and much, much more. So I've showed you that Jesus said it. It was mentioned briefly in a Paul statement in 63, 65 AD, and then John had quoted Jesus' words in 90 AD, and then John's disciples talked about it, and the 100s and 200s and 300s and 500s and 600s, and the church historians are talking about how the foot washing and the threefold communion was practiced ever since the beginning. Now, the Protestant Reformation was preceded by groups hundreds of years earlier which practiced foot washing as an ordinance. Protestant Reformation was in the 1500s, but there were other groups that we know about 1500, much, much earlier, that practiced this threefold communion. Note the quote of the Waldensian Confession. This is 12th century, that's 1100s. We confess that feet washing is an ordinance of Christ, which he himself administered to his disciples and recommended by example to the practice of believers. And then there was another quote about the Albigenses. Now, I don't agree with everything that the Albigenses held to. I'm just trying to tell you that there were groups that practiced this. And the Albigenses were a group that were between the 12th and 16th century. And this was a quote by a Professor Schmidt at Strasbourg. And he said, they had adopted the custom of washing one another's feet in imitation of the example of the Savior, who had washed the feet of his disciple to give them a lesson of humility. Now, certainly humility is there, but you can't expect some people to catch everything of what it means when they themselves have not practiced it. Luther and Zwingli broke away from the Roman Catholic Church 1530 about, and their reform in the area of ordinances was very imperfect. They kind of took the bread in a cup, and the Catholic Church had I get my words mixed up. They believed it actually became the bread, the cup became the body and blood of Christ, and they have that in their service, and they actually have like a re-sacrifice of Christ, and then you take that and you get grace given to you. Now the Lutherans, they don't believe it actually becomes the blood of Christ, but it symbolizes that. And after you eat it, it becomes the body and blood of Christ. And there were other things like the ordinances. They didn't break away from the infant baptism and stuff. So they didn't reform fully away from some of the Roman Catholic misunderstandings of this. But nevertheless, groups before and after Luther's time practiced communion as the brethren do today. And most of the Anabaptists, that's not anti-Baptist. Anabaptist means rebaptizers. We wouldn't accept infant baptism, so we would rebaptize them even though they were baptized as infants. Have believers' baptism. You have baptism after you place your faith in Jesus Christ as your own. A mental statement, a little baby 2 months old or something, they didn't know what's going on. So we didn't accept that. So the Anabaptists, which brethren are just a portion, many of them did the threefold communion. Now, I am not holding history above the scriptures, but what I am doing is helping you understand that all along, from the very beginning, they understood threefold communion. They understood foot washing as part of communion. And so this is something that's not generally known by a lot of people. And when they hear about threefold communion, especially washing of feet, they think we're like the man from the moon. And this has not been created from thin air. This has a history. I want to close by reading this passage one more time. It says here, now before the feast of the Passover, John 13:1, Jesus, knowing that his hour had come, that he would depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. That's kind of a preamble. Remember, he was saying, my hour has not come. My hour has not come. My hour has not come. Now it has. During supper, with this in mind, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God, and was going back to God. Now what did he do? He got up from supper, laid aside his garments, akin to me taking my suit coat off, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel which he was girded. Now, my friends, whatever that means, because of the situation at the time, his hour had come, and knowing the things he knew, this is what he did. Now, that should not be easily dismissed. So he came to Simon Peter. He said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I do you do not realize now, but you will understand hereafter. Now, this is not something about a custom of washing the feet. There was more to it, and he had to be taught what it meant. Peter said to him, never shall you wash my feet. And Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. Now, what in the world does that mean? That's a lot more there, and it means a lot more than just, if I don't wash you, you're out of the club. What did I mean? And Simon Peter, well, he didn't want to not identify with Jesus, so he went 180 the other direction and said to him, Lord, then wash not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. If this is some type of identification with you, man, I'm all with you. Don't stop at my feet. Do my hands and my head as well. And Jesus said to him, he who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you. for he knew the one who was betraying him. For this reason, he said, not all of you are clean. So the bath is salvation of Judas did not have. And then after salvation, there's a necessity to have some type of cleansing going on. That's a work that he is symbolizing here. It's not salvation, but it's some type of sanctification. You go off and get yourself a bath at a bathhouse or a mikveh, and then you come home and you're clean every whit, but what's dirty? Your feet, because you're still on the earth. And my friends, we can be saved, but because we're still here in this crud, there has to be a cleansing and the shaking off of the dirt, so to speak. And God does that by the preaching of the word, constantly encouraging the saints to look at themselves in their mirror and make sure everything's arranged appropriately and they're looking like a Christian ought to look, and iron sharpening iron, and they're rubbing against each other, and they're meeting us at church, and they're helping each other, stirring up one another to love and good deeds. The church interacting, wash one another's feet, be involved with the word. You see what's going on here? Now, if you want to take this and just chuck it out the window and not pay any attention to that, people do. But the Lord wanted his bride to understand that he didn't just save them at the cross, but he's doing a work in their life now by the washing of the water and the word, and that is part of them getting ready and their perfect bride outfit at the glorious presentation at the marriage feast of the Lamb. Wonderful picture. I hope you see it.